from Finland was that for many people it's ritual insurance. If you go through confirmation, you're then an active member of the church, and you can be married in the church, you can baptize a baby in the church, you can be married. There's all kinds of benefits that come from church membership. They don't actually want to go to church. They just want to, if they need it, have rituals available to them. That's clear in Europe. It's also functioning here, I think. And parents have a great stake in this, but so do the volunteers on the education committee and the governing board. Depends. I mean, in my context, it'd be a session, but there are different names, consistories. I don't even know what all the names are, but most congregations have governing boards, and they have a vested interest in this because this is the part of the life of the church where the faith is handed on, and it's a pretty central function of the church. So you have to, in order to bring about change, establish relationships and be in contact with these different groups. Find out and listen to them. Find out where they think things are going well, where things might need to change. And you need to establish rapport and trust, because when you want to do something different, they have to know you well enough and to trust you that you're not a nut, or you're not going to destroy stuff, or that you went to Princeton Seminary and you're a smarty pants. You think you know stuff, but you don't actually know what goes on in this community. So paying attention to who are the people involved in the process. Now, I said that assessment is your friend, or evaluation, and I want to put that into a little bit larger context. This is now drawn from the world of curriculum design. It's also behind it there's American pragmatist philosophy, which I'll talk about. But curriculum design and implementation, the most common framework is called ADDIE. I'm trying to see if anybody in my other class. Oh, yes, Trey is. So if you're going to work on curriculum, it has 5 phases: analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate or assess. Assessment is the word that most people in education use now, not so much evaluation. Now, so I'm saying you probably want to start here, because there's already a curriculum in place, not just paper, but a whole pattern for doing confirmation as a curriculum, a way of doing it, a way of fostering people's learning. So you want to get some information here, because this then, I'll use a different color, I guess. This information is not the end of the process, it feeds into the beginning of the process. You have to use the assessment in order to rethink the context and what's needed, and then design a whole approach, and not only come up with a plan, but really work it through in some detail, and then implement it, and then evaluate it. And so, in essence, this is an ongoing cycle. It's like a spiral. It looks like a spiral now. Let's try it like this, sideways. Okay, so you make progress this way, but you have to go through this cycle multiple times. Even your best ideas, when they're in a particular context, are not going to be fully effective. There's things that you don't really understand, and things you think should work don't work. You got to pay attention to the assessment that comes, the feedback that comes, in order to adjust your plan and make it better. Over time, you will actually be able to come up with a new equilibrium or a new sort of synthesis, but it should be a dynamic one. That's why it worries me a little bit at Grossman Memorial, where they're still using basically the framework we put in place. I think, well, I'm not sure that works now. They're just used to it. And it's, a habit. I think, I sort of fear sometimes that the Christian education leaders now might curse us because it's a sacred cow. And that probably needs to be looked at. Okay. So this is an ongoing process. Start at the end, assessing what's already there. And you're going to find there's some good things. And even if you hate the program that you inherit, you can at least take the good things and find a way to incorporate those in the new design. design. That helps people to accept the new if they can recognize some of the old. Say the form is different, but the concern that you have, it's still there. But we're doing it in a different delivery system. This is roughly analogous to John Dewey's approach to explaining how human cognition works. So you encounter a problem, you define it, you brainstorm solutions, possible solutions. Then you think it through and use criteria and you select a likely solution, try it out, and pay attention to the feedback. And when you get the feedback, usually you're going to have to go back to the definition, to brainstorming, or maybe you selected the wrong one to try. So it's an iterative process. It takes place over time. This is just American pragmatist philosophy, right? This, at least in terms of John Dewey and how we think from 1910. He says it's not just pragmatist philosophy. This is how human beings have evolved cognitively in evolution, which kind of makes sense. You know, out on the savannah somewhere, what made us survive is we could analyze problems, talk together, figure it out, imagine solutions, implement it, and see what happens, and then adjust. We're very flexible people, creatures. So you can see there's some parallels, right? The curriculum is, in a sense, you have a problem, which is there's a gap between what people know and can do and what they can or should know and do. So part of leadership involves analysis of the nature of the gap between where the set point is and where they need to go. And in this case, we're talking in the mode of, I would say, Christian discipleship, helping people to become Christians that are committed, informed, mature, engaged in the life of the church. There's a gap. That's all the curriculum is about, and teaching is always working on the gap between what is and what should be. Okay, so that's like, we got a problem because people aren't fully Christian or not maturely or informed or engaged sufficiently. And then we got to define that in a way. You can't solve a problem if it's amorphous. You have to give it some kind of definition. You could be wrong. You may have looked at it in the wrong way. That's part of what our study is about, is to say, maybe we're defining it or thinking about confirmation in a way that is somehow off or not quite right. And we need to redefine it. But curriculum development, that is design, is analogous to the brainstorming process. And anytime you're developing curriculum, you're coming up with possible scenarios that would close the gap between what people know and can do and what they should know and can do. So when you finally, out of all the possibilities, come up with a pattern or a strategy that is going to work, and then you run it by some partners, or maybe you do it jointly with some key people. But I would take the design before you fully develop it and bring it to the Christian Education Committee and to the governing board, to the parents, to the stakeholders, in other words, and say, I've been listening, and I've heard, and I've analyzed, I've got data that shows, and you don't only have to have, not only have to have local data, but national studies about changing patterns of religion in America, the rise of the nuns, etc. Anyway, we've got a problem. There's a gap. This is what I'm thinking about how we should address that in confirmation. I haven't worked it all the way through. I haven't got everybody lined up. I haven't worked through all the lesson plans, but I've got a basic strategy. And let people give you feedback on that. They need to be able to see some continuity with the past. Otherwise, they'll just reject it. Unless it's such a brilliant idea that they think, why didn't we ever think about it? That pretty much rarely that happens. Usually they want to see more continuity because they're stuck, for the most part, in technical change. But to provide leadership, you've got to have some dimension of what your leadership is about, which is adaptive change. That is, I think it's safe to say, in most contexts, the majority, not all, but let's say 75% of the contexts, in mainline Protestantism, confirmation is not working very well. Most of the time what people say is they want a better printed curriculum. That would be the magic bullet. Part of your leadership is to say, actually, by doing some of this work, that actually there's a lot more involved than just buying the right piece of curriculum. It's a whole approach. And anyway, so get feedback from people, and then, as much as it's possible, take their concerns into account. And I say that, very deliberately. Take their concerns into account as much as possible. Because again, you want them to be able to see that you have heard them. But you can't always just take what they suggest, because some ideas are bad ones, or potentially damaging, or heretical. So you have to make a good faith effort to get the input and exercise some critical judgment. And it probably helps if you do this collaboratively. Find a few people that you trust theologically and or pedagogically in the congregation to work with you. We did amazing things at Grossmore Memorial Church, but it wasn't really just because my wife and I are so brilliant. The best thing we did was we formed coalitions. We found people who knew what they were doing. Some of our best allies were people who had grown up in Dutch Calvinism. And they came to Presbyterians because in the east side of Michigan, there's hardly any Reformed churches. They're all Presbyterian churches. One Reformed church member was worth 3 Presbyterians when it came to knowing the Bible, knowing the faith, being committed. We found a bunch of those in our church, and we put them all to work. And we did some of the stuff collaboratively with them. Now, sometimes they were a little too much, so we had to, calm them down a little bit. But it's good not to hang yourself out there by, just be the only person. But if you get some lay people running with you, even if it's just one other person, that helps. It adds credibility, and they can, especially if they're a member of the church, they can help interpret it in a way that people in that setting can hear it, maybe in ways that you can't. Often, people who have training in education are very helpful. There's also usually a cadre of serious Bible people who've been studying it for a long time and who are uninformed, but you can work with them. Every congregation I've ever been a part of, I have developed a faculty from lay people. Found people who were interested in, tuned in, they've been studying it, they didn't really know what they knew or what they could do with it. So I helped them and by inviting them in. And then you got a cadre of people who are experts with you. So that's part of the process. Then, you got to try it. And you sell this to people the first time you want to make a major change and say, we're gonna try this year, and then we'll evaluate. And or you say, we're going to do this for 2 years, and then we'll look and see what happens. The pragmatist move is really crucial. Most Americans are hardwired to try stuff. We're tinkerers. That's how we invent iPhones and stuff, is we try things out and see what happens, and then we try to improve it. That works. What doesn't work is to say, this is the way we've got to do it. This is the solution. Like it or lump it. That is a hard sell. But and I actually use this, Dr. Osmond will know, with the faculty, trying to get the faculty to accept certain changes to degree programs and the advisement system and so on, and say, look, this is what we think we need to do. We've worked on it, we've analyzed, we've come up with a plan. Let's try it for 3 years. We have a committee in place that actually studies the feedback, and we can find out what works and what doesn't work, and we can change it. You can say, if this plan that we're cooking up doesn't work, we'll know that, and we can make adjustments. That really helps a lot of people to accept and support the possibility of change on a provisional basis. And all you've done is, in a way, you've got them enrolled in this adding process. Because you're saying, look, we've designed and developed, now we want to implement. We don't know if it's going to work fully. We think it will. But give us a shot at it. And then we will have a structured process to gain information, and you'll have a chance to tell us what you think. And then we'll go back and see what adjustments we need to make. Or maybe it's just entirely the wrong thing, and we can go some other way. That actually is a good practice of leadership. It says you're trying to do what's best for the congregation and enlisting people in the process. And you are the steward of the process, of each of these stages, actually. Now, there is a big jump between this and this. In fact, there's even technical names for it. This is the intended curriculum. And this is the actual curriculum. Okay, so you can cook up a great plan, and I hope we will do that actually, at least provide some parameters and guidance out of our national project. But each denomination will take that research data and come up with curriculum and that sort of thing, which we think will work. But when you actually implement it, there's a gap. There's a big gap often between what you imagine and what actually happens. That's not a failure so much as an opportunity, because when you get to evaluation, that's one of the things you want to pay attention to is, we thought it would work this way, it actually worked this way. Why was that? What can we learn from it? What do we need to know from that that will help us to make adjustments, to go back here and do the whole thing all over again? Princeton Seminary, for most of its 200 and whatever year history, has operated on the basis of an intended curriculum. It's only recently that we have gotten serious and gotten disciplined about getting feedback about what students are actually learning. It still kind of functions, though, I have to say, on the intended curriculum. A lot of our colleagues put stuff out there, and we just assume that you're learning it. What's actually happening is probably 90% of it is going into one ear and out the other. But at least now we have some mechanisms to get some information to find out what have you actually learned. And the missing piece in church-based education, especially confirmation, is we don't do disciplined assessment or evaluation. It's the same thing as at Princeton Seminary for 200 years or almost 200 years until recently. And that is, just because we put it out there, we think people got it. When in actuality, most people didn't get it, or they got bits and pieces. It shocks me still. I know this, I teach this stuff all, but it still shocks me. For example, when people who have grown up in the Pennington Presbyterian Church their entire lives, and they're 80 years old now, I'm thinking of particular people that have been in my Bible class. And last year we did a go through the whole Bible in 30 sessions, 15 on the Old Testament, 15 on the New. And one of the first set of questions out of people's mouths when they were in Joshua was, why is the God of the Old Testament so angry? And the Father of Jesus is so loving. They went, what their default mode was Marcionism. The God of the Old Testament is actually probably different than the Father of Jesus. Why is that? So I kind of mess with their categories and say, actually, in the Old Testament, God just kills you, and then you're done. In the New Testament, God keeps you alive without the hope of death in order to torture you. Which is worse? But I digress. What I know is to be true is that we've had tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people go through confirmation. They were exposed to things, but it didn't stick. Most people sitting in the pews have either shallowly formed understanding of what the Bible is about and what the basics of Christian belief are about, or they have misunderstanding. Another one is about Jesus. We've got a lot of adoptionists sitting out there in the pews. We got people who think he was so good that he got a promotion. We got a bunch of other people who think that he was really just a hologram. It was God with a light show, not really bleeding. So anyway, so the key to addressing this problem is with assessment. Assessing what people actually learn. And so finding out from confirmands at the end of the process that you inherit, what have they actually learned? And I wouldn't give them a test. That was deadly. That's what they did at the church I inherited, and they hated it. Well, they hated it in school. Why should you have to face that in church? But there's a lot of ways to get that information. You can have exit interviews. You can sit down, take them out for coffee or whatever, or talk to them, or hang out. Or as a group, there's lots of ways to ask questions or to get them to write short things that will help them to tell you what they actually have learned. But you can't really get anywhere bringing change and being a leader of change until you are grounded in the facts of what those people have learned. Okay, so you got the idea this is a circular ongoing process, and a lot of what leadership is about is managing that when it comes to confirmation, especially managing the assessment data. I think in light of time, I just want to go to a couple of other things. I want to talk about challenges. And part of being a leader is dealing with problems. This is what my middle child learned as the president of her sorority at her college this year. That you have to deal with problems that nobody else wants to deal with. That's what leadership is about, partly. I think I heard President Obama saying something like that not too long ago, saying, you get all the problems that can't be fixed with technical fixes, that they're not easy answers, and it's your job to figure out what to do. Well, here are some of the problems. Adult volunteers, they're absolutely necessary and crucial, but some of the people who want to be involved in confirmation are themselves not fully Christian. This is a problem. Well-meaning people who want to be involved with confirmation for God knows what reason, but they themselves are Unitarians. Or they're radical liberals out on the fringe that think Jesus was just a prophet. They might as well be Muslims for that matter. In fact, Muslims in some ways have a higher regard for Jesus than certain way Protestant liberals. I recommend not headhunting in any aspect of educational ministry. You know what I'm talking about? When you get into the pulpit, when you're coming up to September, and you don't have enough people, you don't have enough slots filled, and you say two things. One, we need anybody. Anybody. Number two, it's not that hard. Both of which are a lie. You don't want anybody, and it is hard work. So that's a lie, and you should stop saying that. Also, you're inviting people with who are predators on children and youth to get involved in your youth ministry, which I have had to deal with. That is a bad thing to do. Instead, it's better to work with the Christian Education Committee or elders or somebody and exercise prayerful discernment. That is, pray for God to raise up for you leaders and invite people to consider whether or not God is calling them to this particular ministry. Don't say, will you do this? Say, would you consider this prayerfully, and then let's talk in a couple weeks. And then have a conversation and see if there's mutual discernment about, they have the gifts and they also have a sense of call. Maybe nobody's ever asked them that question before. Some of our best people in confirmation and youth ministry were people that were not guitar playing 25-year-olds. One of the best youth ministers I ever knew was a guy who was 75 and was an MBA from Harvard and worked for some corporation, and then he spent his retirement rebuilding houses for Habitat for Humanity. He had an amazing ability to work with kids and to teach them stuff and to coach them and be a mentor. But so use the biblical approach. Discern the gifts of the Spirit that have been given to people in the congregation to teach. Do not headhunt, because it's really also very hard to fire volunteers. I've watched this happen at churches that my wife has served. I had to deal with this. Sometimes you have to fire volunteers in the confirmation program. It's not the good fit, not the right fit, for a variety of reasons. Usually, it can either be theological issues or it can be personal issues. I've seen both. The best way to fire a volunteer is not to fire them directly, but to invite them to a different ministry in the congregation that would call upon the gifts that they actually have. But it's hard to clean up sometimes you just inherit these people. And we inherited somebody in the youth ministry program that we finally just fired because he was showing up late and just undependable. And then it turned out 3 weeks later, he was on the front page of the Detroit News and Free Press for molesting boys in his neighborhood. We knew something was not right. We didn't know that. But thank God that it was one of the hardest things we ever did was to fire this guy and to give him reasons why and get him out of there. I know cases where there are people who don't actually believe in God who are teaching. confirmation as adult volunteers. Now, that's kind of a problem. When you're at the core aspect of the life of the church, passing on the faith, you probably need to have people teaching who believe it. So better to call the right people than to get rid of bad ones. But you might have to get rid of some bad ones. But try to help them find a different place. Another major problem is time. Especially, and I'm speaking about the world that I know the best on the ground, and that is white, suburban, affluent congregations. The people in those congregations are perpetually overprogrammed. They live on Starbucks, and they brag about how little sleep they get because they're so busy. And most of the busy has to do with super academics and sports. I am a virulent Calvinist when it comes to hockey, which was the god in southeast Michigan. I just really had a hard time with hockey. And the other places it's soccer. And that they do it on Sunday. And parents will commit to this. They will make their kid go to this. They'll move heaven and earth. But when it comes to requiring something for the church for confirmation, oh God, you were just so narrow and so mean. Why would you do that? So you have to fight for time. Now, I have learned in the digital age that there are ways around that. One of the congregation that I did my qualitative empirical research on, First Presbyterian Church in Michigan, also the same presbytery where I was a pastor, they use digital media to get around the time issue. And I interviewed all these people. I interviewed the kids, the parents, the mentors, the pastoral staff. They all said, we love this program. Because what it meant was they had a flipped classroom. The pastor in charge of providing leadership for confirmation would make videos, 15 minutes at most, about some topic, and post it. And then the mentor and the kid in the confirmation program, whenever they wanted, within a 5-week window, would watch the video and then meet to talk about it. What they usually did was they met at, I'm not making this up, they would meet at Starbucks and watch it together, and then they would talk. But the biggest challenge they had was finding a time that would work both for the mentor and the kid because they were so overprogrammed. But by not having to come to the same place at the same time on Sunday, like during the Sunday morning hour or right after church or Wednesday night or whatever, there was flexibility. It worked. Everybody loved this. So there are ways to work with the time demon. Looking for ways to be flexible. I would say the last challenge I want to just lift up is sometimes you have to interpret the confirmation process to parents whose kids don't want to be confirmed as a matter of conscience. That is rough. You can understand. I can understand why some kids don't want to do that until it happened to my family, and it was one of the worst days of our lives when our son said he didn't want to be confirmed, and my wife and I, both pastors, I'm teaching this stuff. And, it was a shock. He eventually went to the adult members class after he'd gone through the whole thing, but it was difficult. So it's hard for parents to hear that, especially if the church and Christianity means something to you. But sometimes leadership means stepping into the role of an advocate on behalf of the kid. The worst thing you can do is just have them go through the motions. Let's be honest, a lot of kids just do go through the motions. But there are some who actually pay attention and they think it through, and at that point in their lives, they're not ready to stand before God and the church and say, I believe this. It's your responsibility to tell this to the parents. Kids can't often do that. It's too much for them. So you've got to explain, and it's pastoral care, right? Plus they're going to be mad at you because maybe you didn't do it right. But you have to say, look, this is what we've done. This is what your son or daughter has come to. And, they thought it through, and it's honest. And it's not for all times, but for where they are right now, they're not ready to do this. They're not ready to make this life commitment. And that is a challenge. Fortunately, it doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. Okay, I probably got too long anyway. Let me just stop and see whatever questions you want to talk about.
Sort of a starter question. We found in most of the particular qualitative research that the programs were working well, somebody grabbed hold of the leadership. It's something in the recent past. Sometimes it's more past, 5 years ago, 7 years ago. listen. Really, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, leadership matters. These things don't happen by themselves. And so there's different aspects, and I think you can pick up on what I was working through. It has different dimensions, right? So part of leadership is having vision for confirmation. You also have to have some curricular expertise, or content expertise. Fortunately, you're going to Princeton Seminary. We're pretty good about giving you some content stuff about what is the Christian faith and what's involved in that. You also need to have some expertise about methods, because just standing up and lecturing at people like I've been doing for most of this time is not helpful for confirmation. Sometimes it is, but what works best is a multitude of methods that are used, especially in the digital age. Agency, and I could go into a whole big thing about how people have to construct knowledge in order for it to stick and not just be one ear in one ear and out the other. But you have to have some expertise about methods of instruction. So that's just one part. There's another part which has to do with politics. Right? You have to manage the power dynamics. You have to be an advocate for the money, for the decisions, and getting the support that you need in order to make something happen. You also have to have a pastoral care division. You have to have some leadership in that, because remember what I started out, and Heifetz talks about it rightly, that you're managing grief when you're talking about change. And the more significant the change, the more grief there's going to be, and resistance. Pushback, because anger and pushback oftentimes is an index for deeper pain about loss, about something. But also, like I said, I didn't even get into this, but when you're teaching stuff with kids, like we were on a retreat in January, the end of January, we were talking, it was around the Apostles' Creed. And it was Friday night, we just got off the van, situated at this retreat center, and we got going, we had the flip charts and everything, and we were talking about the first article of the Apostles' Creed, God, maker of heaven and earth. And that, we got into that, we read some scripture, we were doing some creative stuff with it. And 3 weeks before, on New Year's Eve, a kid had gotten his parents' Cadillac, a V8, very powerful car, and picked up his girlfriend, who was a member of our church. And in a 25-mile-an-hour zone, was going 80 miles an hour, and it was icy, and lost control, smashed into a tree. He died. She was permanently damaged. So, we'd all in the community been dealing with that crisis for a while. But it was starting to wane a little bit. 3 weeks later, you can't be there all the time in that mode. First questions out of the chute were about where was God on New Year's Eve. And I learned a couple things from that. One, you can't teach confirmation without exercising pastoral care, because you're going to get into questions, especially stuff, where is God in suffering, that you have to have some ability to handle, not only pedagogically, but pastorally. The other thing I realized was people would rather blame God than have God be absent. They needed to make some sense out of that, and the default mode was to say God had some purpose. I think that's bad theology, but that made it possible for them to go forward. What was terrifying was that God would be absent from this world. Wow. So, and I already mentioned, interpreting with parents, but there's a lot of pastoral care that's involved in teaching. In fact, they're two sides of the same coin. I don't think you can actually teach without also doing pastoral care. Pastoral care also has a knowing, understanding, thinking aspect to it, that there's a certain kind of teaching involved. They're deeply intertwined. And you have to have some expertise about managing change itself. So leadership has multiple dimensions when it comes to confirmation. I don't remember what your question was. Okay. But yeah, so there's several different aspects of leadership that are really crucial. It actually, this is one of the,
importance of leadership.
oh, yes.
We have seen the importance of leadership. And it's really more, I would say, maybe, especially the comprehensive way you're talking about it, it's the single most important factor. As long as you're including all the things that you focus on.
Yeah, it doesn't just happen. And the programs that happen well, it happens because somebody was there to provide vision and all this stuff. And I would say also to galvanize leadership, putting together teams and coalitions. So, yeah, leadership matters. What else?
When trying to sell change and selling that we try it out, maybe for people who are out of turn, what have you done? So I would imagine this has probably happened when some aren't on board with that. Because I would imagine some parents might say, why are we trying this out on my class or something like that?
Yeah.
What do you do when there's resistance?
Well, as much as possible, try to work with people. I had more resistance actually to changing the youth program than, oh no, let's put it this way, the Sunday morning schedule. That was practically World War III. I still have scars from that. Changing the confirmation program wasn't that big of a problem, except for the time issue, trying to fight for time against sports. But, well, we had meetings and, to try to articulate rationale. And I think part of my mistake early on was to think that things could change when there's resistance just through reason. And that's not the case. There's a lot of emotional stuff involved, a lot of emotional process, a lot of grief. So we had, in that instance, people that were continuing to be angry and to get more angry. Some of them left the church. And it's interesting, some people become terrorists when they don't get what they want in church, and they'll threaten to pull their pledge and to leave. Now, I can say this because I'm not really in the role that my wife is in. She's in a very different situation. But I want to say, don't let the door hit you in the butt on the way out. Because I don't like to be held hostage, especially when the gospel's at stake. But as a pastor, you can't actually do that. And sometimes you actually need that money. And you need that person. You need them not to badmouth you out in the public. So going to great lengths, sometimes you have to slow down the whole process. And, who's a master of this is Craig Barnes. He is really good at hearing people's negative stuff and implementing a process pastorally to help people get along to a place where they can change. A lot of what's needed is validation. Like you can take care of a lot of resistance by hearing and validating. But some people think that if you hear them, then you agree with them. And that isn't always the case. This even happened in confirmation. I hear you, but I just don't agree with you. And so at some point, you also have to have some backup. That's why I went earlier saying you've got to have some people running with you, building coalitions of people who are established and have credibility in the congregation, but also the CE committee and the governing board. That really helps. And if you're working, you're not the senior pastor. Senior pastors have a lot of influence and power, authority, and you need the senior pastor, if you're not that person, to back you up. You could lose your job over it, because parents, if enough of them, they're angry and disaffected, get together and they decide you're a problem and you got to go, you could lose your job. That has happened. It could happen. So that's why you got to be as wise as a serpent while you're being as gentle as a dove. You got to think politically about change and about power, because in order to implement change, you have to have a certain amount of power, and that. If you are doing it all by your lonesome self, you're probably going to pay a price for that you don't want to pay. Doing it with people, standing together, you could get somewhere. What was your second question?
Second question goes along with that, being flexible with time. Because the example that you gave, I hear that.
You can relate to that?
Yes.
Yeah.
So do you think that we should just accept that and then around someone's time, or address that maybe being a bigger issue? Or is that really in terms of where they're
I've tried a lot of different strategies on that. I've decided that shaming parents doesn't work. Like asking the question, what long-term value will being involved in soccer or hockey do for your kid versus being involved in the church and being a Christian? That has eternal significance. That doesn't really convince anybody. So most parents want their kids to be good people. Truth be told, that's why a lot of people just bring their kids to church, because they know they don't necessarily believe it themselves, but they know the church is a moralizing agency that will make people good people, not involved in drugs and be selfish and narcissistic and blah blah blah. So you can sometimes appeal to that and say, we're trying to work with you to make good on the promises that you made at baptism. Sometimes that works, probably not, but anyway, you can appeal to what their parenting interests are and say, this is part of that. We're trying to work with you on that. But we also, in order to have any integrity to the educational process, we need a certain kind of commitment. And what really makes me angry is people in choir programs at schools and sports programs and you name it, they ask incredible amounts of commitment from kids. And the church just actually asks for nothing, practically. And we get nothing. This makes me angry. Why is it that when the church says this matters and it's going to cost you some time, that is like, you just said my baby is ugly. That's how people react. But when sports or music or whatever requires huge commitment, no, they don't blink an eye. And they don't blink an eye because I think, okay, why is that? Because they think this will be good on their college applications, so they can get into a good college. Actually, like in Birmingham and Grosse Pointe, they're thinking Ivy League. So it's their self-interest. They want but you push it a little farther. What they want is they want a good life for their kids, and they think they're going to have a good life when they go to an Ivy League school and they get a Princeton education, and then they'll get a great job and they'll make a lot of money and they'll be happy. So if you trace it all the way through, what they're really motivated by is they want a good life for their kids. You can affirm and validate that. Problem is that I don't think you need to point this out to them, but you can think, okay, the delivery system may have some issues. But you can at least say, I am about that too. I want your child to have a good life, a meaningful, the best life. And that involves a relationship with Christ and being part of a supportive community, where they're accepted for who they are, not because of the way they look or what their test scores are. So that can be one way to do that. Be an ally with the parents. But I don't want you to be under any illusions. You're not going to convince a bunch of people, and so you're going to have to deal with people who say, sorry, my kid can't be there because they have this other commitment. And so then you have to figure out, what's the minimum they have to do in order to be confirmed? A. B, how much special attention are you going to give to make up time with one or more of these kids when they can't be involved in the program because they have these other commitments? That's one thing you can do, is to say, okay, I'll work with you and I'll make special time. But pastoral life is very busy, just like professorial life. There's a limit to how much you can do that. So when you want to get serious about commitments, about what's required, you really need to have political backup by the Christian Education Committee and the governing body of the local congregation. Sometimes that's what you absolutely have to have in order to face down parents who really don't get it and don't want to get it. And this is just another thing they're ticking off. They're managing their kids' lives. They think it's good for them to be confirmed. They don't really care about Jesus very much, or it's not, maybe a little bit, but anyway, to have any teeth in it, you have to have backup. And that comes from getting this whole process and the thing you've designed through the powers and the structure in the church. Okay, yes. Maybe, I don't know, how much time do I have? One more?
Yeah.
Okay.
You
mentioned
Yeah.
environment where we are. How do we make people stakeholders in the church for something like how do you feel that when you employ us?
Well, there's sort of two dimensions to that. There's the way they already are stakeholders, whether that's for the right reason or not. And then they should be stakeholders, but maybe they're not. Those are two different things. But I would say you've got to work with what people care about. Oh, I forgot to mention this, but this is a key thing. I learned in the process of dealing with this stuff. There's one book on negotiation. It's crucial for being a leader in educational ministry and being a pastor, getting to yes. It's just a small book. It's usually in the business section by two guys at Harvard, Fisher and Urey. And one of the things that you can get into, and coming back to the parent thing, is you can get into positional bargaining. And that ends up being, it can be a civil war. That's not a good thing. I can't go through the whole thing now just because of time, but Fisher and Urey in Getting to Yes reframe the negotiation process, and they want you to aim at identifying what are your core concerns, not the solutions, but what are the things that you care about, and finding out what is it that the person you're disagreeing with, what do they care about? And working at the level of what people care about in their gut, that's better. And then you can maybe come together to work collaboratively to identify some solutions, rather than saying, here's what must be done, and they say, no, this is what must be done, and then you clash. And usually that's not as productive. So I would recommend, I had this in my notes, but you should all buy this and not leave seminary without it. There's a few books like that, but this is one, Getting to Yes, because it helps you to be a leader in confirmation. How you get people to be stakeholders when they're not. I mean, this is actually a confirmation problem. It should be owned by the whole congregation. There's a lot of people who are just happy to have the hired gun do it and the CD committee. But in actuality, when people are standing there making baptismal promises to the whole congregation, they own this problem. How do you help them to be a stakeholder? I would say probably through preaching. And by, putting before them what's at stake in the future of Christianity. I would talk a lot about the rise of the nuns and about moral therapeutic deism, the kind of easy, non-committal, non-Christian focused monotheism that's endemic in American society. And say, the church is, the mainline Protestant church world is in trouble. We're going to die if we don't think differently and act differently about confirmation. That's just a fact. That's a statistical likelihood. So anyway, I would hit it that way. You're trying to reframe, but you can also take it more of an idealistic approach about, what is the church, and we all have the whole community has the responsibility to. It takes a village.
Maybe one last question.
What book would you recommend about the nuns?
The nuns? Oh, I don't know. Ask Dr. Osmer. He's probably got a better book list on that. I just know that it's the nuns.
Polling organization.